everyone. Good to see you. It is one of the Lit Talks for Connecticut Literary Festival again. We have three wonderful writers today who will be reading and discussing about their works. So we are very happy to see you here. So to talk a little bit about the Lit Talks. Lit Talks is produced by the Connecticut Literary Festival, a program of the Central Connecticut State University's English Department and the College of Arts and Sciences, and curated by Festival Director Jotham Borello. Thank you to the program sponsors, Real Artways, RJ Julia Bookstore, and the Yale Writers Workshop. And a shout out to Lit Talks producer, Christiana Torres, and the rest of the festival team. So the festival is moving online this fall. Lit Talks will run September through December. And one highlight, Real Artways Executive Director Will Wilkins will sit down for a reading and conversation with Connecticut's own Wally Lamb on September 24th. The full schedule will be posted on the festival website in the coming weeks, so please keep an eye out for that. Also, in addition, the festival is publishing the inaugural Connecticut Literature Anthology this fall, featuring 37 Connecticut poets and prose writers. Check out the cool cover on the website, and be on the lookout for announcements and virtual readings because there are more coming. Thank you to everyone who submitted to the anthology. So tonight's program is Korean American Literary Imaginations. We have three writers, Krys Lee, Leah Silvieus, and Yoojin Grace Wuertz. After my brief introduction, they're going to start with their reading. And if you have any questions, please save them because after our little discussion, we will save some time for Q&A. So Krys Lee is the author of the short story collection Drifting House and the debut novel How I Became a North Korean. She's a recipient of the Rome Prize, the Story Prize Spotlight Award, and the honor title in adult fiction literature from the Asian Pacific American Libraries Association, among others. And really, there is a robust list that I'm not reading from because I don't want to take too much time. She's an assistant professor of creative writing and literature at Yonsei University, Underwood International College in South Korea. Thank you for joining us from Seoul. Leah Silvieus is the author, most recently of the poetry collection Arabilis and the co-editor of The World I Leave You, Asian American Poets on Faith and Spirit. She holds an MFA from the University of Miami and has awards and fellowships from the National Book Critics Circle, Fulbright, and Kundiman. And her criticism has appeared in a lot of places, the Harvard Review, The Believer, and the Hyphen Magazine, and elsewhere. Yoojin Grace Wuertz was born in Seoul, South Korea, and immigrated to the United States at age 6. Her debut novel, Everything Belongs to Us, which she will read from today, was selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice, longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Award prize, and included on Kirkus Reviews Best Fiction of 2017. My name is Nare Kim. I'm an assistant professor in residence at the University of Connecticut in the Institute of Asian and Asian American Studies. So you have heard enough of me talking about the festival and the writers. Now let's get to the real stuff. Krys, if you can start with your reading from A Normal Life.
I'm wondering how long are we expected to read? I wasn't sure.
Anywhere from 4 to 6 minutes.
Okay, so I'll just maybe read from the first page, first scene. Okay, A Normal Life. This is a newest short story that I wrote, inspired by a certain phenomenon in the kind of subculture of South Korea, where I live now. I've spent half my life here after living in the US and the UK. So here it goes. After Chorong's colleagues had left for lunch, she took her second home pregnancy test and waited for the second strip of paper to change color. She looked up at the bathroom light the way she did when she was a child and imagined God's enormous eye scrutinizing her from above. Knowing she wasn't forgotten used to comfort her until she realized that her first calling was woman. She might sing hymns and take the wine and wafer on her tongue, but she could never forget 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9. Or do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals. For years she prayed she would change. Sometimes she woke up thinking, how little of me is left in God, how little of God is left in me. The second set of results was the same. Chorong took the elevator to the roof deck. It was a rare, unpolluted day in Seoul, and she had a clear view of the world. Behind the main commercial strip of Itaewon, there was Hooker Hill, a mosque, the gay bars where Chorong and Hyunmin, her husband, sometimes spent weekend evenings. Their home that wasn't home. When she was born the last of three girls, her furious grandfather had checked her parts and taken his revenge. At the hospital, he christened her Chorong, a dog's name. She had worked hard her whole life to prove her name wrong. What? Hyun said when he answered her call. How's work? It's just numbers. I've mastered doing this asleep. Like her best friend Hyun was a lawyer. He was a successful and reserved gay man. When they announced their engagement, she was irritated by the universal reaction around her. How could someone as good-looking as Kwok Hyunmin want to be with you? Hyun, I'm in trouble. Just tell me, whatever it is. He took her seriously, immediately. She rarely asked for help. I've really done it this time. I'm pregnant. What? I'm pregnant. That's impossible. He went silent. Who's the father? If I knew. Hyun knew that since Chorong's girlfriend Danbi had left her that spring, she had woken up every morning and died again every night. Danbi had said many things when she left, but what Chorong remembered most was, you're not a risk taker. You lack courage, and you'll never change. So Chorong took up skydiving. She went out every weekend with plans for anything but the predictable to happen. She went to unfamiliar clubs and slept with strange men as if each one would turn her into someone utterly different, someone who had not loved and lost Danbi. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now let's go to Leah, if you can read from your work.
Right, I'm going to read about 3 poems from my book, Arabilis. This book kind of broadly is about growing up as an adoptee in the rural Western United States. And I think that's all I'll say. I'm going to start with a pantoum called Naturalization. Naturalization. When I came to this country, I was reborn with a pistol in my palm. They called me a natural, that bullseye, gorgeous. With a pistol in my palm, the weight like a future sun, that bullseye, gorgeous like summer sunlight on stainless steel. The weight like a future sun, dreaming blood on my hands, like summer sunlight on stainless steel, bright like Christ. Dreaming blood on my hands, they called me a natural, right? Like Christ, when I came to this country, I was reborn. Self-portrait at Secret Heart of Gold Boy. Never forget your anger, baby, a man once said to me. That's where your power lies. And I mistook this recognition for love, having always wanted to hold the two of them in the same hand. Anger and power, like the boys in the movies I didn't know if I wanted or wanted to be. Bust-lipped, chip-shouldered boys, Jimmys, Tylers, Keiths, and Codys. Blue jean, black leather, always white. Guitar riffed and bass-driven, crowd-parting boys swaggering into auto shop, locker room, guts of a flickering mall. Secret heart of gold boys starving for their chance at glory, anointed sun, bud, untapped potential, cooling off on the sidelines after a ref's bad call. Not the good girl I was, back of the ladies' choir bus, bubblegum glossed and glittering like a scream. How I prayed to wake up, believed in, deserving, swinging fists the maverick teacher calms just before the credits. I see you. And having been seen, therefore transfigured, boy turned endless field, turned stadium at sunset, a burning multitude of men believing their empire will never stop winning. Agency. I never cared much for their beauty, but admired how easily the stallions could kill me. My aunt was thrown off a horse at 16. She survived but never looked the same. All traces of the family profile in the cheekbones and chin gone. Now, stumbling from dream and into the field, fists full of peppermints, I plead to the animals, invisible over the hill in the moonless night. I should know by now. It is never about one's skill for finding, but the looked for's willingness to be found. Just as a runaway girl is discovered only a block away, eating dinner at the neighbor's and no further. So her father convinces himself that's all the little girl was capable of, not what she wanted. But tonight the horses, there, down among the beeches, know when I begin to yield, and do not move until I do, turning their heads in the direction of my voice. Before I hear anything, I feel it, their steeled hooves battering the frozen mud, the valley itself trembling as they rush not toward, but somehow beyond me, halting only when they are close enough to pull me under. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Now let's move to Grace.
Okay, I'm going to read from towards the beginning of the novel, which is set in Seoul in the mid to late 70s. And this is right after there's been a protest by labor workers and they're a group of women who have taken off their clothes and become arrested by the police. After the arrests, the women said they had not planned to remove their shirts, that it had happened spontaneously, an act of last resort defiance. When it began, Chizan was far from the center. She didn't know the woman who started it, but she felt the ground tilting as woman after woman threw off her shirt and linked arms with her neighbor, angering one another against the attack. She joined them, flinging off her shirt and bra, trampling the garments underfoot, fused in a human chain of resistance. In the vans, the police reprimanded them like children. Is this how you girls were taught to behave? What? Ajumma, you're too old for these shenanigans. Are you a mother behaving like this? It was warm in the van with so many bodies pressed together, but some girls hugged themselves, shivering, their lips nearly white with the effort of holding back tears. Those who still had shirts or kerchiefs removed them and passed them on to the undressed women, leaving just the bra or undershirt for themselves. She then untied the kerchief from her hair and covered herself with it. It was almost sheer with sweat and useless. Remembering how terrified she had been at her first arrest, she wished she had something to offer the younger girls, if only just a smile or a reassuring word. But they had withdrawn into themselves and would not meet her eyes. Someone started to sing, an older woman with a good folk voice, now hoarse from shouting, "Seya, seya, parang seya." They had been singing it since the first day of the strike, a simple peasant song, asking the bird not to devour the crops. A minor key lullaby, cyclical and easy on an empty stomach. But here in tight quarters, interpreted by this strong, rough voice, Chizan could see the sky and fields. She heard the farmer counting his plants, fearing a lean winter. Hey bird, don't sit in my field. If the green pea flower drops, the merchant will go crying. Why do we sing this song? Chizan asked. It's not the bird's fault for eating. The singing woman had started again, seya, seya, but stopped at Chizan's question. It's not the farmer's fault for hating the bird either. All the more reason, Chizan said, we need a different song. If they were going to sing such a song, she wanted to hear herself in the story. The woman picked up again and sang it through to the end. She hummed a few bars of the beginning. It was a song that could not end at the end, a song that demanded repetition. Bird and farmer, natural enemies, old song. But you see, we need to have a different cycle because it's not natural for us. Chizan couldn't finish because of the way the woman was looking at her. That's the difference between you students and us, the Ajumma said quietly. You students think everything is an argument. We have to work to eat. We can't just quibble with words all the time. Old songs are for comfort, not ideology. But I agree with you, Ajumma, Chizan protested. I'm critical of these attitudes just as much as you are. I only meant we have an opportunity to represent a different message, something stronger that might go further in clarifying our demands. A smile played across the older woman's lips. Do you want to debate me then, right here and now? Wait, we better organize a meeting and take a vote, she said. Despite the clear sarcasm, there was a calm and gentle quality to her voice. as if she were simply explaining a fairy tale to a child. But first, we must collect everyone's suggestions for better songs. This could take a while. We should also make sure to elect the proper leader of this committee. Without raising her voice or even letting the harsh edge of bitterness creep into her words, the woman had perfectly won her point. Chizan felt her heart slamming against her chest, her face prickling with shame. She wanted to say so many things about how she was not just a student playing activist for fun, or the kind of student activist who spouted philosophy and argued theories all day long. Protest quivered on the tip of her tongue. I've given up everything to be here. I share your position. Exactly. But it was not true. They were not in the same position, nor would they ever be, and Chizan had committed the cardinal error, lecturing without permission or proper experience. Forcing amends now would not help. Chizan bowed in apology. Her father had taught her this, to condemn her mistakes with the strongest possible conviction, to never let anyone defeat her with shame. You're right, Ajima. We call people like me mongmul, diluted ink, people who pretended intellectual superiority and activism, but barely lifted a finger to work. Patting her arm, the Ajima picked up the refrain where she'd left off. Little bird, singing and rocking, she held onto Chizan's arm for a long time, an intimate gesture, maternal and possessive, as if to say, this one I claim, I accept.
Thank you very much. So now I'm going to start to invite writers for questions. And if anyone in the audience would like to pose questions, please do so by typing your question to ask a question function. It is where you would see the bar of ask a question function at below the screen. So thank you for your excellent, wonderful readings. And I wanted to ask all of you to speak a little bit about the setting of your stories or your poems a little bit, because it seems that place figures really prominently in all your works. Like Krys, your earlier books, like Drifting House or How I Became a North Korean, like really wonderful books, as well as the short story that you have read, are set largely in South Korea and also in China and in North Korea as well, places that are not America. And Grace, your work is also set in South Korea nearly entirely, except for the Korea part. And Leah, your work does not necessarily say where it is exactly, but the place is a really important, has a really important recurrence in all your poems, actually throughout other poems that you have not read as well. So do you guys mind speaking a little bit about the setting, why you chose it and what it means for you and your story?
I can start. I find it really difficult to write about a character without writing about where they come from in the sense of place. I feel like when we write about someone or when we meet someone, like meeting a character is like writing a human being in life. And the more you get to know them, the more you understand that an individual is their family, is their society, is their immediate environment, and the environments that haunt them from the past as well. And so I think when I write, always the place becomes part of who the character is, and place is also the place of the present, the place of the past, and the place of the potential future. And because I was writing first from what was closer to me, both America, South Korea, and then because of my activism work, North Korea and the Chinese border, a lot of my places were those areas. But it's interesting because the novel I'm working on right now is placed in, all around the world in different places, also imagined places, because of who the characters are again, who are both, there's characters from everywhere. And when I'm writing about characters who are either invented or people from, like, let's say Kerala in India, again, I find I really have to know and learn and understand the place in order for me to actually understand that character. So I would say this. I would say the same for A Normal Life as well too, which is of course Korea, but it is also that special place of Itaewon and a culture of people who there are an LGBT culture that's very alive there, but it's also a culture that's for many people in that community hidden as well too. And so, I was exploring that.
Leah, do you want to go next? Maybe we can go in the order.
Sure. So a lot of my poems take place in the places I grew up in, the rural western United States, so Montana and Colorado. And I was very struck by what Krys was saying about fictional characters, meeting fictional characters and understanding where they're from and what haunts them and their families. And I feel like that was kind of the project in this book as an adoptee, is coming to terms with these questions I would get, like, where are you from? What's up with your family? Who are you? And I think for so long, I tried to draw a direct connection to Korea and just wasn't finding traction. And so with this book, I was thinking about the places that grew up and the narratives that formed my identity growing up in communities that were very religious, that saw God's providence as inherently part of adoption. What does that mean? And so I think by engaging with the communities and with the landscapes there, I was able to get at some of these questions about identity that eventually led me back to thinking about how I was haunted by being abandoned and these nascent connections to Korea. But that's kind of where it started, with what I could feel and what I remembered as a child.
Grace?
I think for me, setting and time were so intertwined and indistinguishable. Like, I had started with my parents' stories and history, and of course, because we were an immigrant family, the entirety of their story as young people had happened in Korea, and it had happened in the 70s. And so I became fascinated with that setting, and also specifically that time, because of course, any place changes over time, but the rapid pace at which South Korea changed from the 70s, 80s, and 90s was just so unique in recent contemporary history that it almost felt like a lost era already. Even though at the time of writing, I guess this was 5 years ago now, but it should be considered recent past, and now it's considered historical fiction because I think it's 40 years. But it just was very personally fascinating to me how much a setting could change in a relatively brief period of time.
Thank you for your answers. And following up with your insightful points, I was wondering what kind of works does it take to write about those settings so closely? I know, for instance, that Grace, you researched about your parents' past. You had interviews. You probably did more interviews of your own. It's a very, very, very well-researched book, I must say, very detailed. And Krys, you just mentioned a little bit about Korea because you live there right now, but researching into this very particular community. And Leah, you were speaking about this intense probing of what that space means for you and how that space connects to your personal experience as an adoptee writer. And in one of your interviews, you even actually talk about how you always never write about adoption, but you always also write about adoption. So if you guys can speak a little bit about what it took you to write about that particular setting or the topic or the character. I think it's all intertwined at this point, as your answers reveal. And if there were any extraneous work that you had to do just because it is a queer community or about adoption, but in rural America, or about historical past, as you guys have mentioned. And Grace, for instance, you, in just the section that you read, there were multiple Korean words that some you translate and some you don't. So what were some of the works that have gone in to your works, or what are some of the works that you actually took out because it didn't make sense? So some of the choices that you made. Any order you guys want?
So am I still on? Okay. So yeah, I did a lot of personal interviews, and I did research in as much in English language as I could, and I found that there are really interesting and robust photo archives that I took advantage of, even just online. But I found too in my own memories, because I had left Korea in '86, and I was born in 1980, and I had left in '86, and the book is set in '78, and so you know, theoretically, I had no business, quote unquote, remembering any of these events, because I obviously don't remember them. But I would do this little mental exercise because I remembered some of these feelings and the senses of having lived in Korea in the early '80s. I would do like a rewind in my head, and dating myself here, like when I was a kid, we had tape decks, and you get very good at, like, if I press it down for 3 seconds, I'll get to the next song. Or if I press it down for X many minutes, then maybe I'll get to the next 2 songs. And so I became very good at rewinding, like, 8 years in what I imagined to be the pace at which Korea was changing, to get to the details that I couldn't get at because they were not in my own memory. And it was a fun game for me.
Sorry, it just keeps going silent. I cheated a little bit, I would say, in the sense that, again, I ended up writing a novel about North Korean defectors because I had been an activist for many years in the community and was very close to many North Koreans, as well as activists, and a few that I considered like siblings. They were like my brothers and sisters. And same with the queer community in Korea. By default, I lived in Korea for quite some time, and many of my friends, especially in the arts community, but also outside of the arts community, were queer, and it was just living in that world, knowing their stories. And often I'd be the only straight one sometimes. Or there was one time where there was 4 poets and me, and I was the only straight person in the room. But that was very normal for me, and I think that part of what ended up becoming my interest in writing this story was because, again, like with North Korean defectors, as well with the LGBT community, I felt as if there was a kind of personal anger that drove the stories, and that we're all the same people, and yet we're so often denied basic human rights. And in the case of both the North Korean defectors as well as with the queer community in Korea, I just felt like they weren't often given the same respect and treatment as anyone else. And it's just like, but we're, for me, oh, excuse me, sorry, that's my dehumidifier. My apologies.
Talking about human rights, the machine's kicking in.
But I felt as if these were the very same things that were happening, and I wanted to explore that in story form. I think it's a lot harder for me now in the 3rd novel I write, where, again, there is sometimes less of a connection to certain characters, and I've struggled for many years trying to really understand that. So that's why I call it kind of cheating a bit, in the sense that it's a world that I knew really well and intimately, and so it grew. The stories and the novel grew out of that, rather than the reverse, which is what's happening now in the book I'm working on.
Thank you. Leah, do you want to speak a little bit?
Sure. So I didn't I don't think I did any external research, but I think the project of this book was going back into memory and trying to understand why I remembered the things I did. And the religious tradition I grew up in was very kind of like story and allegory based. And so we were taught that everything in the world happened for a reason. Everything was infused with kind of spiritual power. And so I tried to revisit these moments or these images from my childhood, trying to construct some kind of meaning or understanding how, maybe trying to think how deer that my father shot in our front yard kind of illuminated something about the community I grew up, about violence, about gender, about survival through kind of environmental challenges and things like that. So I think it was more of a kind of a review of trying to understand how I understood the world when I was a child, but from the perspective of 20 years, 25 years later. And so it was kind of like trying to do research on my younger self, while also trying to keep those moments of those communities and those landscapes intact. And that's something I've kind of realized after I've done the book. It wasn't so much active when I was writing the poems, because the writing of the poems seemed much more dealing with, syntax and images, and how it trying to make the poem kind of cohere as units. And I think stepping away from the book, the bigger project was trying to kind of make sense and kind of reconstitute myself as a young child and young adult growing up in those spaces.
That's fascinating. It's really interesting to hear when the writers talk about what you're writing about, which seems like both so intimate to your childhood or personal stories, but that's also really actually not. So I'm always very fascinated to hear your stories. So we have two questions from the audience. One is any advice for young writers, and speaking more about your next work. Actually, the question is asking the novels or the works that you're working on right now. So I'm going to actually save those questions as the last question. So if you guys can keep that in mind, I'm going to ask you to end with the works, the text that you're working on. What is it about? What are some of the questions that drive your creative energy, and what you can pass on to young writers. I wanted to ask a little bit about the violence and community, which seems to be really important in all your works. It seems that in actually all three of your works, violence is like so important, but it seems that violence is inflicted upon in a very intimate setting. Sometimes, as Grace, you were reading, it's like a really beautiful scene, which is this like communal literal like hooking of arms between this like female workers protesting together, but like very physical as well as like symbolic building of the community going on as like one body. But it very quickly breaks down as you actually highlight, and that happens throughout other portions of the novel, where this very intimate friendship also breaks down, the belief and trust between lovers break down. Leah, you explore so much about the violence of toward animals and people, and religious violence as you have read from your poems, expectations. Krys, about, I wish you could have read a little longer, because your short story so complexly captures this idea of love and trust and family and betrayal and violence in a way that I would not even dare to summarize. So if you guys can talk a little bit about that, like so much violence, but also intimacy and community and trust. It's both very metaphorical and symbolic, but also very literal. So do you guys want to, I know that I just threw a lot there, but do you guys want to talk a little bit about those? Anyone who would like to go?
So in the case of the opening scene of my novel, the women have lined up for a multi-day strike, and then they see the riot police have arrived, and the riot police have given their final warning and said, if you do not disperse, we will have no choice. We will have no choice but to physically remove you from the premises. And this was an event that happened in Korea in 1974, and I took liberties with the date. But for the most part, I kept the scene intact. And what had happened was the women, faced with this threat of violence, took off their clothes, thinking that their nudity would protect them. And so they were, and what a, to me, it was just such a fascinating statement on the fluidity of symbols too in human vocabulary, because when I was writing this, or shortly after, I don't quite quite remember the timeline, but the Pussy Riot in Russia was largely in the news, and those women were using their nudity as a very active form of protest to say, grabbing the attention and forcing some aggressive in a powerful, empowering way upon the public. And in this case, with the women in Korea, they were saying, the purity and the sanctity of our bodies will protect these men from touching us, which is in some ways a very regressive comment on female bodies. And what happened was their exposing themselves infuriated the police even more so to create an even more violent attack on them. And then after that, the women were so traumatized that some of them just never recovered emotionally or mentally from the trauma. And so there are so many levels of shifting violence that was being communicated in what was probably an instantaneous response on both sides, that when I read that in my research, I thought, okay, this spoke so powerfully to me about the culture at the time. It was very, very specific to that time, those women, those gender relations, that political time that they were in. And so, a reader now, an American reader who might not know the history, they might receive it in a totally different way, but it might still be powerful. And so I thought that was a very rich moment.
I think that growing up, many different kinds of violence surrounded me, whether it was, people hunting, everybody I knew hunted. There were a lot of, I think, accidents and chronic illnesses in our community that I haven't really begun to understand why that was the case. But it was a culture that was very insistent on kind of being stoic and being faithful and not grieving. And I think that part of my aim with my work was trying to find a space to grieve some of that violence and some of that loss that also probably relates to adoption in some way, and finding the mercy, those small moments of mercy and grace and love and forgiveness that can be maybe teased out of those moments of violence. And that's something I didn't really realize until after. There was an interview I was doing and somebody was talking about these moments of mercy despite the violence of this world. And I was astounded because I thought back of those poems and I didn't see the mercy myself. And I think it was kind of a subconscious way of kind of revisiting those places and trying to find something that would, redeem them is a little strong of a word, but trying to find an entryway into them that didn't just end up with more loss and more grief that was kind of interminable.
I think that's a great point. I find that really interesting because I grew up in a very religious family, but also a family where violence was in our bones. And it was, for me, faith and grace and beauty and violence were inseparable. I was surprised when I began to write fiction, and I thought that was the past, as if the past is separate from the present and the future. And I found I was obsessed with these themes, and they came together, that I could not separate them in my own work as well too. And my first couple books were very much, kind of explored that territory of physical violence as well as faith and love and trust and, all those things kind of coming together. But then I'm finding more like in my short story, A Normal Life, that the violence is also it comes in the form of power. The power that something has over us, which can also be the church or faith or our belief, but and also the violence of society or governments. And the way I feel about governments today, and the way that the power, what it does to its people, that based on a stroke of a pen, lives are destroyed, houses are razed. And I'm really, I've become interested in the violence of communities and social violence that I think is just as powerful, just as destructive as the violence against the body. And in the end, as Nadia had kind of inferred, my short story here, Normal Life, is a ghost story. It's literally a ghost story. It doesn't look like it at the beginning, but it's a ghost story that these are ghosts that are created by a cycle of power and violence.
That's a really beautiful answer, all three of you. And I like that last sentence, the ghost and power and beauty and violence. Thank you. Before we turn to the last bits of the questions, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the genre. Krys, you hover between short story and the novel. You do both so wonderfully. And Leah, it seems that you actually started out as a poet, but you also were interested in writing fictions, although it seems that you exclusively write poems. But it also seems that you write a lot of actually editorial reviews and book reviews, and which I think takes some of a different framework to approach creativity. And Grace, I only know of your first work and I don't know what other works you're working on, but it's a really fantastic historical fiction, as well as in a sense, it's also a Bildungsroman, although all the characters have also already come of age. They do reach some sort of strange Bildung by the end. So I wanted to ask how you guys approach this genre that you guys are working on, and what it means for you to contain your story into that specific form. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm actually a failed fiction writer. I grew up writing stories. I wanted to be a fiction writer. I applied to MFA programs in fiction and poetry and was not accepted in fiction anywhere, and was accepted in poetry. And I think now I've become kind of a narrative lyrical poet. I feel like one of the ways I just admire fiction writers is it seems like you can hold these huge worlds, and I feel like I can only hold what I can hold in my hands as a poet. But at the same time, I feel like poetry allows me to tell stories about small things, and I would still love to be able to learn to write fiction. But I think that kind of being able to work within a smaller expanse, while still honoring the impulse to tell stories and ask those questions, is kind of where I've landed for now. But it never feels solid. I always feel like I'm trying different ways of writing, and seeing if I can get to the same questions in different genres.
I'm going to call myself a failed poet. I actually started in poetry, and then I ended up in fiction. And I still occasionally write a poem and never show it to anyone because it's too embarrassing. But I miss poetry for its dizzying turns and the way that you can, that it's not governed by, it doesn't have to be governed by a prosaic logic, the way a lyrical poem can move and jump and surprise us by going completely different places, or listening to Heather McHugh's lecture where you were moving, the way a poem does. But I feel like short stories are cousin to poetry, and it can do so many of the things, not everything, but so many of the things, or the way a poem moves. And sometimes, I write a short story more as if it's, the way that maybe a prose writer would approach it. And other times I end up writing a short story and moving intuitively by letting language following the image, or following the rhythm. And actually, that's probably why my novel right now is taking so long, because I actually started the poem it started my novel in progress, without a plot. I decided I just wanted to follow words, and I was going to follow images, and those images and words were going to tell me who the characters were and what the plot was. So it's taken a lot more time. But it's also, I think, it made me more, and the language, I wanted language, and I wanted images, and I wanted a different kind of governing logic to take primacy there. And that's been fun, though it does take a lot longer that way. But I love moving between the forms. And I think, for example, the essay form is incredible. But, people like Joyce Carol Oates, they're really lucky because she has so much stamina and she's able to write in all the forms because she can just write so many more hours a day in front of a computer than most of us can.
Oh, wait, I forgot to. Okay. Yeah. I too am a failed poet. And my problem with poetry, as much as I adore it, is that I just am incredibly wordy, I guess. And I couldn't edit myself. And I'm like this in life too. Like I wish I were, a very sleek modernist, but I think I'm just maximal in life as I am in words. And so, and I never meant to become a historical fiction writer either. And I think the reason why I stumbled into that territory is my greatest and most intuitive obsessions are about relationships and relationships within generations. And so because the obsession lies in generation, it's that you can't take history or time away from it, because that's by virtue of those gaps in understanding between those people that the tension lies. And so as I was writing the novel and realizing with great dismay that it was going to have to be historical fiction, because at first I had had this part of the story as a flashback. In the novel was supposed to be about these people's children, and the flashback was the part that everybody said was the story. And so I resisted it for a long time because I said, I don't want to write historical fiction. It seemed very daunting to me, but it ended up that way. And, I now am very confused about what's going to happen to future projects and things like that, because, I spent so long within that historical fiction framework that I never thought I was going to do.
It's really fascinating because I think you guys spoke not only about the particular form that you are working with, but also how you work with your creative energy, like what the process of writing is and how it actually progresses for you. So I know for the sake of the time, we have to move on to the last questions, which segues nicely to the current project. What are you working on? What are some of the questions that drive you? What form? Or if you can actually even speak a little bit about what COVID was like, what this pandemic is doing to your writing routine or the problematics that you're working with or working through. And any tips for younger generation of writers, any inspirations, tips, stories, anything.
Novel that I'm working on is, someone told me it would fall into the category of what's called the new weird. I'm not sure, but it does take place in the near future, and it's, it both plays with kind of, I guess you could say, fairy tale, as well as maybe other genres, maybe a little bit of sci-fi. I'm not sure because I wrote it. It emerged from a dream, and then I started with images and words, as I mentioned. But it's tentatively called Wonderland. So that gives you an idea of where it might go. And then I'm kind of playing with, and I've been starting a a book as well, another novel, and that's actually based in Peru, going to Patagonia, which is a journey that I've taken and kind of inspired the book. And in terms of advice for younger writers, I think first find a writing community, a reading community, a support community. People who writing is so discouraging. I think everyone in this room understands that if you're working on a novel, or if you're working, I think, on a book of poems, it's very similar in that way. It's long. There seems like you'll never see an end, and every time you think you found your way, you get lost the next day. And that writing or reading community, the people who are going to be there or encourage you when you don't believe in yourself anymore is extremely important. Second is just to not lose faith in yourself, to believe that what you're doing means something to you, and that's enough. Hopefully it'll mean something to someone else too, but as long as it means something to you, I think it's worth pursuing and it matters. And third is just to stay, like Cheng Rui Lee told me, he was just like, stay at your desk. Even when it doesn't feel like anything good is going to happen, if you sit long enough, eventually something happens.
I believe that. I think that if you sit at your desk long enough, something will happen. I'm having a very hard time finding time to sit at my desk lately, just because. So what happened was that I sold the novel, and it took almost 3 years or something like that for it to come out. And in the space of that novel coming out, I had written another one, and it just I have struggled to make it come alive or make it work. And before this novel, the one that sold, there was a novel before that. So I kind of seem to be having like a one on and one off and one off, one on and one off type statistic. And so, it has been very discouraging. And in some ways, the political climate right now, I'm really struggling with, because the novel that I had written right after this was quite contemporary and about, class conflicts and things like that, were deeply, weighing on my mind. And in some ways it was too contemporary, so that now when I think to go back and try to revise it, it feels both too raw and also dated at the same time. So, it's become a very tough thing. So I might have to just kind of let that one go, as I did with the first manuscript that didn't sell before the one that did sell, and see what happens. And as for, I'm taking Krys's advice about not giving up, because at the moment I'm just kind of biding my time. I have 2 young kids, and nowhere to send them, because this is the reality that we're dealing with. And so I'm holding on to that old trope that, to a writer, there's no such thing as wasted time. So hopefully something's percolating in here. Nothing is getting written.
Weird time.
So I'm back in graduate school again. So I've been writing a lot of seminar papers, but trying to find a way to sustain my poetry life. And I've been fortunate to work with several professors who really encourage kind of infusing creative writing with academic writing, which has really been amazing. But trying to find poems, and also trying to be patient that, if this is what I'm working on, and poems will come when it's time to come. And as for young writers, I think, write about what you feel compelled to write about, even if it's frightening, even if you feel like maybe you shouldn't write about it, maybe if you're waiting for permission for somebody to say it's okay. I'm giving you permission, write about it, because I think I spent so many of my early years being afraid of writing things, being afraid of what people would think about me, or if I knew what I was even trying to say. And I think that once I was able to push through that, that's when the work started to get interesting. And then the second one is just find things that feed you. I think community is really important, but I think if I started out wanting to write novels, and I ended up being a poet. And so if maybe you want to write a poem one day and a short story the next day, if you want to take up a musical instrument or learn how to dance or whatever it is, I feel like all of those energies are very nourishing in different ways. And so I think, don't try to narrow your focus too soon, because you never know where you're going to end up.
That's excellent advice. Krys, I think you're mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that in that it's like that feeding is so important in that, especially I think if you're writing a novel or you're writing something long, it's so easy. And I see people that start to live extremely hermetic lives, and then eventually there's no more oxygen left in that in that tank or that room, and you've exhausted something. And we do need to be fed all the time, but it's so easy to kind of limit that. And the other thing is just that I really felt for you, Grace. Life gets so busy, and especially a woman with children and job. There's just no space for oneself. It feels like sometimes. And I just want to say for all the writers out there who are writing, who are published, who aren't published yet, something that Lauren Vandenberg had said, which was when it gets really busy, sometimes it's just enough to wake up in the morning and before you've done anything, you're still in your pajamas, write one paragraph, you know, and you can do that in like 10, 15 minutes. That's the amount of time that sometimes it takes just to do a little yoga routine. Just that one little paragraph is what sustained her sometimes through half a semester. And then eventually that one paragraph became a short story draft.
That's really beautiful advice. Do you have anything else to add, Grace or Leah? Nope. All right. So thank you so much for your wonderful work and for your wonderful reading and questions and answers today. It's really a privilege to work with contemporary writers. It's really interesting to hear some of the things that go on, and it's really humbling to hear all these years and energy and efforts and frustrations that actually have percolated into this beautiful writings and really powerful writings that you guys have done. For the folks out there, these two books are out. You can find it in many places. And Krys, the entirety of A Normal Life is published where? I think I lost Krys there. But Krys's first two novels, short story collection, The Drifting House and How I Became a North Korean is there. And also the short story that she read from today, A Normal Life, is in, I want to say, Latham's Quarterly, but I am not entirely sure. So thank you so much for tuning in, everyone, and thank you, my wonderful writers. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.